So in our first lecture on the philosophy of religion, we talked about the general goals and orientation of this particular way of thinking about religious phenomenon, religious beliefs. We looked a little bit at the history of religion. We looked at the diversity of religious views. And then we looked at the historical origins of the Western tradition of philosophy of religion. We ended that lecture by reviewing the major arguments that are offered up that are trying to give reasons for concluding that the traditional Judeo-Christian monotheistic deity doesn't exist, that there are reasons to suppose that there is no God in this sense. Now we want to turn our attention to the other major position with adherents that offer up significant numbers of arguments, and that is theism. So we want to look at arguments that seek to establish as their conclusion that that kind of monotheistic Judeo-Christian deity, in fact, does exist. Either we have reasons to suppose that that deity exists, or that deity necessarily exists. So Russell gives us a number of different arguments, but I really feel that some of those arguments are tweaks or versions of a particular sort of major argument for the existence of God. So we'll start off by looking at the ontological argument. It's an a priori argument trying to establish the nature and existence of God on the basis of the concept alone. Then we'll look at the cosmological argument. And the cosmological argument is, in my opinion, a posteriori argument because it has a presupposition about the nature of causality that I don't think is inherent in the very notion of causality. Then we'll look at the argument from design, which is definitely an a posteriori argument. And it's the argument that probably most people who run across an argument for the existence of God are going to run across. We'll look at what I consider to be a tweak or a slightly different version of that argument in the form of the argument from natural law. And then we'll turn our attention to the fourth major kind of argument for the existence of God, arguments from morals. And we'll look at an argument from morals simpliciter, and then we'll look at what I consider to be a sort of tweak, a different way of formulating the same kind of argument in the form of the argument for remedying of injustice. And we'll look quite a bit at Russell's responses to these arguments, but we'll also go a little bit into the general responses within the philosophical literature. So this is St. Anselm, as you recall, and St. Anselm is generally credited within at least the Judeo-Christian tradition of giving formulation to the ontological argument. And the idea behind the ontological argument is the idea that we saw in Descartes' Meditations, that the very notion of God is the notion of a thing that must exist. And so the first premise then says that our notion, our concept of God, is of the most perfect being. That is, a creature that exhibits every positive characteristic imaginable. The second premise then says, but the most perfect being would have to exist necessarily, since if it failed to exist, or to exist always, that would make it less perfect than the most perfect being. So a form of perfection in this terminology is existence itself. And since this is the most perfect being by definition, it must necessarily exist. And so the conclusion then is God, the most perfect being, necessarily exists. Now, this is the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher. He was born in Königsberg, Germany. He grew up within a very sort of strict pietistic religious tradition. But when he wrote his Critique of Pure Reason, he criticized all of the traditional arguments for the existence of God that were prominent in his time, and then he offered up a different argument for the existence of God and advocated that argument while rejecting these others. And Kant's criticism of the ontological argument is sort of famous. So what Kant says about the ontological argument is that he says, look, conceptual truths don't imply existential truths. So what has to be true according to a concept doesn't correspond to what has to be true in the world. And you can come up with examples of this by showing how concepts that seem to necessarily imply existence for things that you clearly think do not exist would be proven to exist using this strategy that's employed in the ontological argument. So it's what philosophers call a reductio ad absurdum. If those premises were true, then that would result in a contradiction. That is, you would prove the existence of something that clearly doesn't exist. Hence, one of those premises, at least, can't be true. So the first premise in this kind of argument would be the following. I define the concept of Wonder Bunny as one of a bunny that exists of necessity. So it's a necessarily existing bunny. And just the concept of a bunny that exists of necessity. Now, the Wonder Bunny would have to really exist, therefore. Since if it failed to exist, or to exist always, that would violate the definition of Wonder Bunny. Therefore, the Wonder Bunny necessarily exists. And so this is a counterexample to the ontological argument in Kant's mind, precisely because what Kant suggests is even if my concept says that this is the concept of the thing that has to exist, that doesn't mean that my concept actually has any instances. So we are familiar with concepts that don't have instances. The difference between the concept of God or the concept of Wonder Bunny is that part of the concept is that it's a thing that exists of necessity. But that doesn't change the relationship between the ability to conceptualize something and whether or not it actually exists. We can conceive of things that would have to necessarily exist, but that doesn't mean those concepts actually have instances. And so this is Kant's critique of the ontological argument. And essentially what he's saying is the mere ability to formulate a concept of a necessarily existing creature doesn't mean that that concept actually has any instances, that it actually corresponds to something in the real world.